I think I want to start out with an obvious question that I think I may know the answer, but maybe not everybody does. What exactly is alternative journalism?
Well, first, let me just say thank you for inviting me here. This is really exciting. I've been coming up here to talk to Joe's classes for a number of years, and I kind of made a joke earlier that I felt like I've been coming in the back door, and this feels very much like the front door, so yeah, I'm very excited about this. Well, what's funny, alternative media, if you recall, as I've asked your classes in the past what they think alternative media was, a lot of times what people will say is, or used to, they would say things like alternative lifestyles or, you know, something kind of radical. But what it really is, and what the correct answer is it's an alternative to traditional media or to the media that's already in a market. A lot of times, like in Jackson when we first started, you know, and still, there's a lot of corporate media, you know, starting with the Clarion-Ledger and a lot of the TV stations, a lot of radio stations. So what we're doing is an alternative to that. You know, it's locally owned, it's independent, which, by the way, is what the free means, not that we're freely distributed. We do some things differently, which we'll probably talk about a little bit today. But what it's not is, it's not just a journal of opinion. You know, it's not, a lot of times when, especially young people want to write for us. I just had this experience, some in Starkville when we started up there. A lot of the students who wanted to write for us said, oh, well, I can write a 2,000-word opinion piece. You know, and that's what they turned in. And that's not what it is. You know, it's longer form. It's more often, longer form, not always, often more in depth. We try to get out of the he said, she said, you know, dynamic, which to me is just somebody's opinion and somebody else's opinion, and they often cancel each other out, and there's no truth on the other side. We try to do deep research, a lot of context, you know, you know, when people are talking about crime, we try to give a bigger context, because it's often not what people think it is from the media that they're getting, you know, like the TV stations in Jackson, if it bleeds, it leads. You would think that all that happens in Jackson is crime. And the truth is, crime has been way down in Jackson over where it's been in the past. There are reasons for the crime in Jackson that we need to talk about. There are solutions for the crime in Jackson. So that's the kind of thing that we try to do, is that we try to be more contextual. We also, we are certainly progressive in the sense of, in the you know, the real meaning of the word, we believe in progress and reporting the kind of journalism that is going to help us as a state and as a city achieve progress. And that's the way we define alternative media. Not every single one of them define it the way. We're actually kind of different from some of the others. But
I think there is a long tradition of alternative journalism in this country that goes all the way back to Thomas Paine at the beginning of the country and country's history, through the 19th century with the black press, on into the 20th century, the Yiddish press in the late 19th century, and then George Seldes, I.F. Stone, Dorothy Day, and so forth. And here in Mississippi as well, you have a tradition. Ida B. Wells, Bill Miner's Capitol Reporter, and so forth. You tapped into that tradition with your name when you created the newspaper. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, just to backtrack slightly, I'm from Mississippi. I mean, and I'm from Philadelphia, Mississippi. I'm from Neshoba County. And some of you, many of you, most of you probably know that that's where the civil rights workers were killed, Cheney, Goodman, Schwerner. You know, and we talk these days in business about our Genesis story. You know, for me, growing up in a community where that happened when I was 3, and nobody told me those stories, really ever, in the community, and I had to find out about those really bad, very nationally publicized things that happened in my own community when I was 14 on my own because a TV movie came out. You know, there's something missing here in our state, and it has something to do with who we are and our potential and why a lot of young people want to leave. You know, why I left the day after I graduated from Mississippi State, saying I was never going to live here again. So to come back to your question, what was missing in my upbringing, and that I certainly didn't know what Mr. Minor was doing in Jackson with the Capitol Reporter, or even the paper, the Kudzu, and some of those papers back in the day that were being more the kind of journalism that we're interested in. What was missing is this kind of media. You know, there stories and conversation and difficult things. You know, media that challenged me to be smarter and to ask questions. I didn't even know you could be that kind of reporter growing up in Neshoba County. I thought it was all about sound bites and the Neshoba Democrat and just this kind of what I call now press release journalism, which I'm just not interested in doing or publishing, right? And so to come back to, when I finally came back to Mississippi, it was after, you know, it's probably correct on my Wikipedia page, whatever, there's a whole bio there, but I helped start papers in other places that were focused on telling the kinds of stories that would help with social justice, right? And meaning just help make things better for people, you know, for all kinds of people, for women and for abused people and for gays and lesbians and for people of color and young people, you know? And so that's the kind of journalism I was interested in. So, but I was scared to do it here. And so it wasn't until I had done it for a good number of years out there and helped start papers and wrote for the Village Voice and just did lots of stuff, that I went to Columbia to get my master's degree. And mid-career, because I thought I was just going to teach, I'm done with all that. At Columbia, I did a master's project that sent me back to Mississippi and to write about race relations in Mississippi. Scared to death to do this, right? It's like facing my own demons. There's some kind of Joseph Campbell thing in here or something. I don't know. There's just something there, right? So I come back to Mississippi to do this master's project, and all of a sudden there was just this monster awakened in me that, you know, that's where I want to do this. So, but I didn't know that I was going to start a newspaper, and I didn't know that Todd and I were going to start a newspaper. You know, we came back to Mississippi, and we came to Jackson, and we got to Jackson, and Jackson was a remarkable place. And partly because it had this rich history, as we've discovered in civil rights history, the whole state does. But it was also, it was a place where we had remarkably progressive people, so many progressive people of faith, for instance, of different faiths. But young people and people of color and artistic people, people of color and white people who were artistic and creative and didn't know each other. So to bring you, I swear I'm coming back to his question. So when we got to Jackson, what we realized is that this was just a sleeping giant of a city and the state, I believe, we believe, but you need to start in the capital city. And so when we decided, we kept talking about what Jackson really needs is an alternative paper, because the media here is pitiful, with due respect, or not. Just some really bad media. Crime, 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 crime. And, you know, passive, 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 whatever, just bad stories. And so we wanted to do this and we just kept talking about it. So finally, we started getting serious about it. You know, 9/11 had happened, our travel, our freelance was kind of drying up, so it was time to put down some roots as in our postage stamp. You know, got to quote Faulkner because we don't miss, right? So we started talking about this, but we wanted to do a diverse paper. And this is where we come back to the Mississippi Free Press. We didn't want to do it if it wasn't really diverse. I don't mean some kind of BS, pretend to be diverse thing, right? I mean really diverse. Staffing, readership, events we cover, distributed in every neighborhood of the city. And a lot of alt weeklies are not. Okay? That's just true. So as we're putting together, and we had no money, you know, it was just this kitchen table idea. But as we're putting it together, a friend of mine had come to Mississippi, whom I had mentored, and then we helped each other through the years, and helped us come up with a business plan. And she found the Mississippi Free Press name in a book about the black press in Mississippi. And we were trying to come up with a name. And, you know, Jackson Weekly and this, and thank God we didn't use that, the way that, you know, the media world's changed. Talk about dated. And she yelled out Mississippi Free Press. And the Mississippi Free Press was a newspaper during the Civil Rights Movement that Medgar Evers, and who I assume everybody has heard of, one of our heroes, civil rights heroes, Hazel Brannon Smith, a name you should hear about if you are interested in media in the state, a woman who was ostracized, white woman, who helped this paper, and a good number of other people. Those are the two I like to name. And it was kind of a civil rights movement newspaper that was published out of Jackson. And my friend yelled out Mississippi Free Press, and we're like, okay, done. There's no need to talk about it anymore, because that's what we want to be. They didn't last that long. They were boycotted and harassed and all these things, but that was the legacy that we wanted. And so when we heard that name, that was it. It's like we wanted to be the Jackson Free Press. And, you know, and then people started calling us the JFP, and it just kind of went on from there. But that's what we grew out of, was that desire, not to make money and do all these other things, but it was to actually be that, to fill that void that had never really, in many ways, or hadn't been filled in a long time.
You're fond of quoting Hazel Brannon Smith. What's the quote that's in your...
I ain't no lady, I'm a newspaper woman. It's in my email signature ever since I found that quote. Actually, a reader brought me these fabulous old magazines that he had, and one of them was Look or Life or one of those from the 60s. And there was a full-page picture of this woman who died penniless, by the way, after all this. I just want to say that. She's from Lexington. Died penniless because of what she did for our state. And there was a full-page picture of her, and that quote was at the top. And I'm like, okay, I will never use another email signature again. Done. That's it. That says it all.
I'll throw another quote at you in your sort of self-description of the paper that I found online. Steeped in literature and the blues while informed by pop and hip-hop culture. Explain that.
You know, well, it's funny, I hadn't thought about that quote in a long time. A couple things come to mind. One is that that's who we are. I mean, it's like part of, you know, I didn't tell my little history story at the beginning, but when I left Mississippi, I was going to law school in D.C., and I dropped out after a semester because I hated it. And I became a DJ, a club DJ. And I did that for 10 years. And part of what I was doing, I was playing, it was like in the 80s, all the music y'all listening to now in many cases. And a lot of that, and hip hop and rap was one of the things that I was playing. And it was also one of those things that, you know, all these white club owners in other states in the North were coming up and saying very racist things to me because I was playing that music. And I got to understand kind of the origins of hip hop. So, but that's not the whole meaning of that. The whole point of that is the past and the present and the future, right? It's like our culture, we are who we are, and whatever we become in the future is because of where we've been. And all of our music is all about our very difficult past. And it kind of grows out of that. And so music is important to our readers, and so that's part of it. But we're not a paper that's just about the past. When I first came back to Mississippi, I thought, you know, I'm going to go back and I'm going to help put those old cluckers in prison who killed all these people. This is my whole goal. I'm going to write books about the past, you know. And I'll be honest with you, it's one of the things I've learned and wrestle with, because I'm pretty energetic, but I still got only, you know, so many hours a day in me. And wrestle with this idea of how much time do you spend on the past and the present versus the present and the future. And I think for any kind of grounded journalist or writer who's interested in those things, that is a struggle. Like, you know, we helped put James Ford Seal in prison, and we're very happy about that. And if you don't know who I mean, look him up. Don't have time to tell you the story. But who, you know, a Klansman who had, you know, helped kill 2 men in Natchez. And this was something we were really up in and involved in. And that was exciting. And I'm really happy that happened, you know. As much for the state as anything else, that we finally get around to doing these things that we should have done a long time ago to show we're different. Not just say it, prove it. But the thing I ran into quickly when I got here is that there's so many problems that are still going on in the Mississippi, you know, that stem from our past, no question. our wealth inequality, if we take time to understand the context, we can figure out why our cities and our communities are so divided, or why the symbols at Ole Miss are so powerful and real and important, or the state flag, why these things matter. They are symbols of our division. And so, but we need to know that, right? And so, but they're here and now. What happened with the statues now, right? And I would argue that it's not that it happened, it's the reactions around it that matters. Do we defend things? Do we say they're important? Do we try to do something? You know, do we use it to build our future? And so if I'm always kind of trying to put old Klansmen in prison, even though there's a certain pleasure in doing that, then I'm not in the here and now. And so I'm not talking to young people about the things that are happening to them, zero tolerance policies and cradle to prison pipelines and abusive alternative schools, and you know what I mean, crime and perceptions and continuing racism and wealth inequality and all that stuff. So the challenge, I think, what that represents to me is this need to marry up the past and use it to understand where we are. Because one of my fears, I mean, so many of you here are millennials, you know, you're in a generation that's really engaged and wants to be engaged and change things, right? A lot of you could nod, and you know, it's like I deal with you guys all the time, and you want diversity and you believe in diversity, right? But what I will also hear is that you don't always want to talk about it. You just think you want it. It's different now, so let's not talk about that. But the problem with that approach can be, if we don't understand these things that got us here, we're going to reset with things very uneven and unequal, with certain people running and struggling to catch up, while some of us, by the virtue of our skin tone and this dumb history that thought that we were better than everybody else, get to be ahead just because of who we are. That's what privilege is. I'm privileged, and I come from illiterate parents and grew up a lot of the time in a trailer park, and I still get privilege. And my understanding that it doesn't hurt me. In fact, it helps me. See what I mean? So what I'm saying here is that we got to marry that stuff up. And you know what? It's fun. You know, we like to have fun. And so it's like getting to know these stories. I'm editing a book right now. There's some issues up there about this Berglund walkout. And I'm editing a book written by a young, he's like 31 now, I think, graduate of Ole Miss, Sigma Nu, who is writing a book about the civil rights movement in Macomb. And he's telling me, and it's like, it was the bombing capital of the world in the 60s. Did y'all know that? I didn't know that. And it's this crazy action-packed stories that are so engaging that if we know them, we're going to understand some things better now. And so that's the marrying up.
You know, I think I've got this statistic right. 75% of your readership is under 44 years of age.
Is that right?
We're still on target with that?
Okay. He knows those things better than I do.
And yet we hear all the time younger people are less interested in print media and so forth. I mean, what do you do to reach out to them, and how do you, how do you explain that?
You know, we got to blow up the old media model. It doesn't serve us anymore. No, I mean literally, but it's like, you know, a lot of the disruption in media, I'm sorry, this is radical to say, sitting in a journalism school, a lot of the disruption had to happen. Because it's corporate media got so fat and happy and lazy in many cases, not all cases, so I'm not saying all, I mean as a big thing, right? That it wasn't serving people. You got corporate media sitting here in Mississippi with people just passing through from other places. They're not going to go out there and tell the stories in this powerful, in-your-face way. Young people want to read. It's just maybe they read differently, or maybe you use a different medium, or maybe, you know, you approach it differently. But I don't want to read a lot of the stuff that I have seen in traditional newspapers in a lot of recent years. I read media just like you guys do. I roll over in the morning, I pick up my phone, and I start looking for stuff, you know, and check out my Twitter feed and see what interesting things I've curated into my Twitter feed. This is the way I consume media too. Todd doesn't in the same way. I do though. But here's the thing, but as far as what it is, you know, we have to tell good stories. Everybody wants good stories. We want narrative. People engage. And if you guys, how many people I've heard say, oh, young people aren't interested in the civil rights movement? No, they're not interested in you standing up there preaching at them about how they're not interested in the civil rights movement. But this young man who I'm editing his book, he was at a funeral in 2008, I think, and heard people whispering, older, you know, adults who'd never told these stories to their kids, just like they didn't tell them to me, over there whispering about all these bombings and stuff. So he wanted to know, just like I wanted to know when I was 14, well, what did happen? And then he got all up in the research and everything and discovered that all these kids who were 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, right? Most of you are like either that age or older than what I just said. Were doing these remarkable things. And they had courage and they were doing things. So what we have to do in our storytelling as journalists, first of all, is that we can't assume people don't want to read our stuff and go around whining about it all the time. It's like, ugh, stop. Let's just do good stuff people want to consume. They want to read. That's my thing. It's like, let's just do good stories. And I see it work over and over and over again where people, the issues that we get picked up the most, and when we first started the paper, we thought, okay, we still do this, but we thought, okay, like every other issue, we had to do a soft cover. You know, it's like fashion or wellness or, I don't know, something, you know, music story or something, stuff that's important. And then every other issue, we'll do like the hardcore stuff. And so everybody's going to pick up those soft issues, and we're going to hope that people pick up the hardcore. I'm talking 5,000, 6,000 word stories about even civil rights stuff and, you know, like the Berglund walkout story and things like that. And what we found, and we thought, okay, they'll pick up the soft ones, and then we're going to do these anyway because they're important, and we're going to try to build it. What we discovered very quickly is that the harder core the cover, the quicker it got picked up. And we're in the middle of Mississippi. Now, there are big magazine covers, you know, with, you know, graphical and all this, so that helps. But still, it matters. So I don't believe for a minute people don't want to read. We read all the time. It's just a matter of whether we're putting something in front of people that they want to read. And as far as younger, your question, younger people, let's not talk down to y'all. You know, let's talk up to you. Let's assume you're intelligent. Let's assume you want to be engaged. Don't be mad at you because nobody ever told you something about the past in a way that interested you. I mean, come on. I mean, how arrogant of us to make those assumptions about you. Or how about asking your opinion on something like what's going on at City Hall and then putting your picture in the paper. If you're going to do he said, she said journalism, at least do he said and she said. And not, you know, and put diverse faces in your publications that have nothing to do with music or sports or, you know what I mean, or crime. You know, have real diversity. And people, I mean, people respond. I don't know how else to put it.
You have a very active online edition, and now you have an online publication in Starkville as well.
In that other college town.
In that other college town. But you still see print as viable in the future. You see a future for print?
You know, I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller, but I do know that print still brings us the majority of our revenue. It's one of those kind of paradoxical things that we're all dealing with. Todd just talked to digital media marketing class about disruptions and how do we deal with all that. You know, and it's a constant thing, disrupting. I mean, we were a disruptor. If you don't believe me, ask the Clarion-Ledger. We disrupted. So I'm all about disruption. I mean, some is good and some isn't. I think, I don't know what the future of print is. And so what we try to spend our time doing, and Todd more than me because he's the real innovator in this equation, and he's also the publisher, and he's on the business side, and we do have a wall between church and state. So I can talk about big innovative ideas, but not get into the granular of the business side. But what we try to do, I mean, we're going to ride that print wagon as long as we can, especially as long as it's giving us most of our revenue, you know, and see where it takes us. But at the same time, and I think it's important to you guys, if you're going to go into journalism, and we started talking a whole lot about entrepreneurial journalism, and I don't mean being an editor who's running a story for an advertiser, a branded story or something, that you don't tell your readers that's not what I mean. That's not what we mean. We mean that all of us have to worry about or be concerned about innovating, right? It's just the world we live in now. We have to innovate. We have to be willing to do that and think about things. And if you're small, that's easier. You know, it's easier to rebuild a house if it's little. And so that's one advantage. But so print, I don't know. I don't obsess over it. You know, sure, I like print. I've been in print a long time, but it also kills trees. I mean, you know, we spend, what'd you say yesterday, $400,000 a year in print? And we're little. You know, that's a lot of money that so we could figure it out, you know, without paying for, and printers are a pain in the ass. That's the other problem to deal with. It's just like, there's always something. And so, you know, I'm just not, I'm not one of those people who holds on to that past in that way. Now, yes, as long as we can and it makes sense revenue and readership wise, sure, but I don't know. We got to figure out how to do good journalism, how to monetize it in some way or another. Will it ever be the fat corporate journalism the way it used to be? Do I miss that? No, I mean, I don't think we go back to where Gannett was fat and happy and had 30% or whatever it was profit margins.
That's a good segue into my next
question.
Okay.
And I don't know his questions.
What doesn't the Clarion-Ledger do or other mainstream media do that makes the Jackson Free Press necessary?
Not enough time.
In fact, one of your cover stories was on the Clarion-Ledger, and I guess it's, you know, it's sort of what's happened to the Clarion-Ledger in recent years and so forth, but I'd like to hear you sort of address this.
Well, there really are a couple of things I could address, but I would say the biggest problem with kind of sanitized journalism or corporate journalism in many cases, now there are exceptions, so understand me, I'm not saying every single instance, but in general, there's when you're focused on profit margins and shareholders, you're more focused on keeping people happy on some level, right? Than you are digging in and being willing to piss off your strongest supporters, which, trust me, you know, anytime a mayoral election comes up, and dang it, we have another one now, you know, within a year of the last one, we piss off some of our strongest supporters. So the big thing, though, is context, to me. Context. If you're just going to trot out crime story after crime story without context, you're just going to scare the hell out of people. So we sit there in Jackson, Mississippi, the capital city, that's already got, you know, all this kind of race-infused hatred coming from the rest of the state because we're majority black and more progressive than the rest of the state, and, you know, they're worried about our power there, and it just crap, right? We already got that going on. So then you get these not uncontextualized stories about crime. So nobody wants to come into the city and spend their money. This is the way it was. It's changing. But more importantly, people feel disempowered because crime is so bad, there's nothing I can possibly do about it, right? And it's like, the last thing media needs to do is disempower people by beating you up with hopelessness. Now, I'm not saying that we don't do negative, quote unquote, negative. We're never negative to be negative, okay? And in fact, some people say, oh, you're so positive. And then some people who we criticize say, you're so negative, you know, but it's context. It's to understand where do those crime, you know, the Clarion-Ledger a few years ago, we went after them hard over crime. a few years ago. They've actually gotten marginally better on it just because I think they got beaten up so badly from us and our readers about it. But just crime, they put out, like, there was this, if I can make this short, there's this thing that publishes every year called the Morgan Quitno thing about the most dangerous cities. Y'all know what I'm talking about? And media outlets will cough it up, and they do it to sell books, you know. Let's just be honest. And the FBI says, no, don't use these statistics because they lump everything together, and they call, somebody breaks into your car and you're nowhere near it, they call it a violent crime, right? They lump it all together, and then they put out these rankings about Jackson is the fill in the blank, 6th most dangerous city in the Southeast. And maybe that's because we're one of the poorest and we have a lot of break-ins and whatever the case. I'm not justifying crime. I'm just saying the context of that is not what they say it is. And then they make these big headlines out of it, and they don't compare crime to, it just they're not thinking. They're just putting this junk out there, you know, or they don't fact check. They don't fact check things. They don't usually fact check, but they don't fact check things. We fact check. They don't fact check things that are public officials put out in a quote. You know, our crazy Frank Melton, don't get me started, when he was there, he had his quote one time, and now he just said crazy stuff almost every time he opened his mouth. Part of what made him interesting, but you had to fact check it.
The late mayor of Jackson.
Right, who I was his main nemesis in the media. And who he probably liked the most, so figure that out, but by the end. But he said one time, he had this outrageous quote, just outrageous about, and I don't remember exactly right, but made it sound like, I don't know, some absurd percentage of Jackson Public Schools drops out. Like absurd, 80%, I don't know if that was it, but it was something crazy. And I read this quote in the Clarion-Ledger, and I'm like, what the? And then so I look for the next sentence. Because I think it's fine to quote some public official saying something stupid and then point out that they just said something stupid. Maybe didn't call it stupid, but you say, well, actually it's 20%. And then, you know, you see where I'm going? Nothing. I mean, no fact check. So it's like this, it becomes this thing where people don't have the information they need to make good decisions. You know? And so that's where I am on it. It's like we want you to have, we're all about figuring out how to do something about crime, and that's just one of so many examples. But we want you to then feel like you can do something about it. And then we give you solutions too. And younger people you ask about, the studies show that younger people get real turned off by media that just complain a lot without giving solutions, so they know what to do next.
So it's lacking context, perspective, you think?
That's a biggie.
The coverage. You know?
That's a biggie, and it's also not enough storytelling. Mm-hmm. You know, some of the stories, one of the things I talk about in writing classes is how a lot of stories will feel like, they'll read like you're at a carnival throwing balloons at a balloon board. Y'all know those games, pop, pop, pop. And you're reading a story, and yeah, and I'm not, well, yeah, I probably am picking on Clarion-Ledger, but you know, I look down on them now in my new office, so that's kind of fun. But so you throw darts at a balloon board, and things are not in order. And so a lot of times I'm reading these stories, and it's a complicated story about tort reform or some district, you know, that whole Scruggs thing. You know, I'd read things in the Clarion-Ledger about the Scruggs thing, and I'm like, what is going on? I don't get it. Then you read Curtis Wilkie's book, and it's like, okay, I get it. You see what I mean? But things are out of order, or they're not, and I like to say this to young journalists and the older ones sometimes. If you're standing in my office and you can't explain to me what this story means because I'm confused by a section, you are not ready to publish the story because you don't understand it. So a lot of times you'll read stories in media that I get a sense as an editor, I know the writer didn't understand it because it didn't take time to understand it. So if you don't understand it, you're just going to throw a bunch of quotes out there, and then your reader's going to read it and say, ooh, that sounds bad, maybe. And you don't understand it because I like explanatory journalism, another word we could use for alt media.
The great writer,
Or my
journalist
only.
Norman Mailer once said that journalists help keep America slightly crazy. The reason is we don't connect the dots. We sort of throw the facts out there and whatever, we don't connect the dots.
Oh, yeah.
You know? And so that's perspective. And
Oh, connected. That's it. That's a good way. I just talked forever about it, and he just said it in that short little piece. So that's it. Well, you got to connect the dots. And when you connect the dots, then a lot of time, like one thing I love to do is a big old mind map, and we use lots of whiteboards and drawing things. And how do they connect? When I read Curtis's book about Scruggs, I mind mapped it. Like I have all these maps, so I understood. That sounds a little crazy, I realize. But I wanted to understand it because some of the people interest me for my own purposes. And so I'm like drawing that, so I could look back at it and make the connections. We do that with stories. And sometimes if you map something out, like when I was covering Melton, and we do these link charts or mind maps, and then you all of a sudden you think, oh, he was connected to this person. And I figured that out merely because I mapped it. I mean, that's kind of investigative journalism, and all that is connecting the dots. Or being willing to look for the dot in the first place.
You worked at one time for the Village Voice in New York, a major alternative newspaper. Like many others across the country, that eventually was bought up by a corporation. So the corporatization of even alternative media, do you see that down the road possibly for the Jackson Free Press?
Well, we're not. What do you mean? It's like, could we grow and have other papers? Sure. But as far as...
or be bought by Gannett.
God, I hope not. I mean, the truth is, I'm not sure why we would do that, because we didn't start it for that. It's like people buy a house to flip it. You know, it's just really not me. You know, it's like, got to move in, got to move out. You know, but it's like we started this newspaper to be what it is, or what we're trying to be, at least on our best days, to be what we are on our best days. I don't want to be arrogant, because trust me, we're not great all the time or whatever. But it's not for that purpose, you know. So this idea that we would do that, it just doesn't even cross our minds. I mean, we've turned away. You know, we had people who tried to invest money in us years ago who wouldn't have been the right fit, and we really needed the money, trust me, and we said no.
If not bought by your enemies or opponents or what have you, there is another potential, and I look to far away to Poland as an example. In Poland, during the Solidarity movement in the early 1980s, the Gazeta Wyborcza, which means electoral gazette, not exactly a very sexy title, but this was sort of an underground or alternative newspaper that those people out there who were bringing down communism in Poland looked to get real information, not to the official media and so forth. Today, Gazeta Wyborcza is one of the major newspapers in Poland. It's a mainstream newspaper. Do you see yourselves eventually perhaps becoming mainstream in that sense? Just popularity of what happened?
Well, you know, phrases. I don't know. The truth is, there are a lot of people in Jackson who think we are the Jackson newspaper now. And we don't actually call ourselves alternative much anymore. You know, we usually talk about that when other people ask us about it. Because, you know, so much has happened. You know, when we first started, it was before a lot of these disruptions had really taken hold. And so we really were like nipping at Goliath's heels. And being annoying, and you know, we were like the fleas that wouldn't go away. You know, bzz, bzz. And so now it's like the corporate media is in such trouble that it's, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know many people who read, you know, I don't know many people under 40, or certainly 35, but increasingly 40, who read the Clarion-Ledger, or who watch the daily, or who watch TV newscast at night. And so it's just not something we think. We think a whole lot more these days about innovating ourselves, like how we deal with things like how we're going to make more revenue on mobile versus the website, while we're still trying to make more money off the website, make more money. I mean, earn more money to pay people off the website versus print. Those are the things, and how we're going to increase our voices in other places. We think a lot more about that than we actually do about old school newspapers.
I've heard you say before about how important it is to sort of be a part of the community, to be invested in the community. What sort of things do you do that sort of make you truly part of the Jackson or broader community? Is the Jackson Free Press very involved in different kinds of?
It's everything, and Todd, if he were up here, he would call it event marketing, too. There are two sides to so many of the things that we do. Well, part of being the local, really old school newspapers, before this kind of corporatization in the middle, let's call them middle school newspapers. But the old, were engaged in the community, right? When it was the Daily in our state, it's not a great example because our dailies were so racist that the way they were engaged in the community was not, was bad. But in a lot of places, the daily newspaper was it was the social media, that where you got the paper and knew what was going on, and they sponsored things, and and all this. And so we try to recapture the best of that, and part of what we have to do to be local is to be really engaged in the community, not just throw our headlines on social media. We have to talk to people and meet them where they are. And we always had that attitude, that y'all don't have to come to us. Like one time we heard, actually, I'll say who it was, I don't care. The Northside Sun publisher had said something about he was surprised that our old mayor didn't come to his office more. And I'm like, he hasn't been to my office either, but I've been to his office a lot. So you see what I mean? We try to go where people are. Just like I say, with the best stories, you go to where people are. You don't meet them at the coffee shop. You don't have them come to you. You go to them. You walk in their shoes, and then you tell great stories about them. And so being engaged in the community, there are certain things we're really interested in, and so we've learned that you kind of have to focus your personal energies. And so a lot of the things we do, one thing that we're celebrating this year, the 10th anniversary of the JFP Chick Ball. And the Chick Ball is this big event that we do every summer that's to benefit a domestic abuse shelter. Now it's so much bigger than that these days, but in Jackson, the whole idea is that it's to engage young people in philanthropy, so it's cheap to get in, but then we'll peck you to death for your money for silent auctions and fun things and all kinds of stuff. And then it's all women music, all chick music, because the other goal was that when we first started up, you didn't see enough girl bands for my taste, and a lot of guy bands, but not girl bands. And so we started promoting that, and now it's we got tons of them, so it's easy. So that's a big event that we do, and that's become much bigger. It's become about sex trafficking and funding programs to help abusers stop abusing, much bigger than buying food for the shelter these days. And anyway, it's huge. And so that's one issue. Anything to do with racial reconciliation is huge for us. I mean, Todd just is now the kind of immediate past president or chairman or whatever of the retro-named Jackson 2000 Race Reconciliation Group. They do all kinds of study circles and events and all kinds of stuff. And so that's something that he's been really involved with. In the past, he's been involved with the film festival there, not so much anymore. We do a huge Best of Jackson party every year. We give Best of Jackson awards, and we give the best party in town the last Sunday of January every year, and always in a part of town that people don't expect. Metro Center or Jackson State Student Union. I mean, all kinds of things. And then the other thing that we do, a lot of young people engagement, which is what I do. I help high schools. I talk to high schools. I talk to colleges. I, just mentor young journalists, and because that's our future, and try to get them to do this kind of journalism.
Okay. Should I leave is Bill here? I'll leave a little time aside for Q&A maybe at the end, but I want to ask, I looked through a lot of back editions of the Jackson Free Press, and you've really done, you've done in-depth cover stories and what have you on things ranging from private prisons to abortion, sex trafficking, immigration, so forth. Certainly, in-depth profiles of mayors, even Choka Lumumba, I think 4 years before he became mayor, or 5 years before, as a prominent lawyer in town. And the story is Cedric Willis, the man who served 12 years in prison even though he was innocent. Do you have like one particular story you look back to as like, man, that's where we really nailed it and sort of became the sort of the standard that we'd like to always aspire to or something?
I don't know. Well, the Cedric one is a good one. I mean, it's hard to say, you know, different things, but the Cedric story, I like the Cedric story a lot, and if I remember, I'll go put it at jfp.ms/Cedric later, so you guys could look it up. But it was a story that we did that wasn't, we didn't get him out of prison, right? I had a new editor who really wanted to write a long-form piece. He was taking my writing class. And so I was watching for him a story, and I'd seen something on the media, at like WABT or something, about a man who'd been in prison 12 years for a crime he didn't do, and I thought, that's a story. I know what the story was yet, because you know you got to go report to find the story. But I knew that was a story, so I suggested it to Ryan. Turns out we knew the Innocence Project attorneys who'd gotten him out and all this. Long story short, he went and he spent several months. Cedric was out already, so he spent several months with Cedric, kind of watching the way he was trying to integrate back into society, which is a big part of the story. And he did this amazing narrative story that also brings in, and it really revealed in a way that had not been revealed, how the district attorney at that time, Ed Peters, and the ADA, Bobby DeLauder, screwed that case. And around the same time, they were becoming heroes for prosecuting Byron D. Beckwith for Medgar Evers' murder. So there's a lot of kind of ironies and stuff that you uncover when you start poking around, and even questions about why maybe anyway, don't get me going. So we did this story, and so we didn't break it. This is my point. We just did it our way. And our way was spending a whole lot of time with Cedric, spent a whole lot of time figuring, and he had all this history of Parchman as a farm and a violent place and just all this stuff. It's really interesting too. And dug through and understood how they hid evidence and just all these things. And then we did the story. I won't say hid evidence. I'll say didn't notice certain evidence. How's that? And I'm on tape. So they did those things. And then we wrote this story that made Cedric very real. And I use it all the time to teach. It won a National Feature Writing First Place Award. First big story he'd ever done. But more importantly, what happened from that story was we got a call, and there was this preacher from South Africa, Alafi, for Galloway, who gave us a call and said, I want to meet Cedric. He's out of prison. You discover in the story that I think they gave him like $50 when they left prison. It was some tiny amount. That's it. No restitution, right? And said, okay, good luck. So Reverend Alafi called me up and he said, I want to meet Cedric. I want to help him get a job. He'd never used a computer. You know, I mean, nothing. He didn't have a car. And so Alafi got together with him. Long story short, Alafi helped him raise money, helped him gave him a job for a while, helped him, and helped him go to the state legislature and lobby them on a restitution law, where if this happens to you, you get more. Because one of the powerful parts of the story is when you figure out he left basically empty-handed. You're like, what the? You know, it's powerful when you read that. And so he made those changes, you know, and Cedric, to this day, if media try to call him and tell his story again, he'll tell them to call the Jackson Free Press because I'm done. I mean, we milked everything out of Cedric. You know, he's just tired after that. Cedric comes and talks to every one of my intern classes. And I'm giving up the secret if any of you ever come and intern. I never tell them he's coming. They study his story, and then he walks in and tells them how he thinks good journalists act, and we've put together this list of things. And he's a good friend, and he does talks for the Innocence Project and all this stuff. I mean, he's just a wonderful guy. that's the story, in some ways, I'm more fond of than even the work we did on the old cold case stuff, even though that was important. But because remember what we talked about back at the very beginning, how do you marry up the past and the present? It's like, to me, that's using this very tragic story. And he'll say, I mean, Oliphant said it was because of our story. You know, and a lot of people have said that about various stories we've done. And so they use that as impetus for change. And that's, to me, I don't get why people would be a journalist these days if they're not passionate about good things coming from what you do. It's too hard to work. And then you don't make enough money, usually. You know, so you do it for a reason. And that story captures it for me.
We've just got just a few minutes. If there's anyone has a question.
Yes, sir?
I wanted to ask you about advocacy.
Advocacy?
Do you take the position as an editorial board, well, you know, we try to steer clear of that, we're not MSNBC, or do you say, we're an independent, it's okay to advocate for certain things that are undercovered in the mainstream media?
Right.
And if that's the case, how do you make decisions as a board about what issues deserve coverage in an advocate way, and are those mainly Bill of Rights issues?
We're not MSNBC, first. Although we're friends with, my voice editor is a producer for Maddow, so we're friends with her, and so we get on Maddow every now and then. But we don't really use the word advocacy, although I respect it. It's probably a long answer, so I'll try to give it short. We really try to advocate for the truth. And I don't mean that sounds a little flip. I don't mean it that way. It's like, to me, if you're really pushing hard to get at what the truth is, or at least as close, and I mean truth, you know, like not some, everybody thinks this is truth, and this is truth. I'm talking about, let's get at it. You know, the truth of what happened to Cedric was in the system, you know, and there's something in there. So and then this idea that, you know, we didn't go lobby the legislature for the restitution for Cedric, but we tell the story in such a way that somebody hopefully will. See what I mean? So we try to tell stories in such a way that people will be motivated to do what hopefully is the right thing, or to take actions. Now, some of our stories that we do are done in a very in-depth way that you still might get to the end and not change your mind. Like a death penalty story, I want to tell a real story about both the victim, you know, as well as the people who are the human beings who are being put to death, you know. And so I think we're all smarter if we just tell really good stories. At least we can cause the conversation that then will lead to something else. Does that make sense? You know, I am personally pro-abortion rights. But one of my main reporters, and somebody I may be about to hire, when personhood was up, was an evangelical woman who was anti-abortion. Okay, that worked for us because we had this real team of people, so we could get at something beyond the blah 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 blah. So I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I am telling you the way we think of these things. It's not like we set out, yes, am I advocating against domestic abuse? No question. I'm guilty. But, you know.
For example, like the LGBT community now.
Right.
It's been in the news because of this new bill.
Right.
Religious rights bill. So do you look at that and say, well, you know, the LGBT community, there's been undercoverage in the main media, so let's sort of, you know, focus on bringing that story to light for our readers. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
We probably.
It's sort of like advocating.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, that's probably something we do naturally, but I'm going to be honest with you. The people around us and young people just want to cover that LGBT. The Starkville kids students, just went crazy over that issue. Some of them are gay, some of them aren't. See, when you get to human rights issues, I'm not going to apologize that I don't want a Jim Crow law for anybody. So there are certain issues that get up here for us that it's like they're just so obvious. Now, on unions and labor issues, I have more complicated views than Joe does. I mean, no, that's the wrong way to put it. More undecided, no, I didn't mean that the way I said it. More undecided views. No, I know. But I mean, Joe is more of an advocate for unions than I am. Even though I believe we need to report more. I see it slightly more, I see it more complicated for me personally, is a good way to put it. That's what I meant. I said it wrong. I'm sorry. But so I challenge my reporters to ask those other questions regardless on a lot of issues. But, certain issues just rise above. I mean, for me, and I will be unapologetic, it's like for rights, and maybe this is what you were saying in the first place, just basic rights. We're just up here. I mean, the government does not have the right to do certain things to people's individual, and to me, LGBT rights, that's a civil rights issue of our time. And if we didn't think that was true before they try to come forward with this thing that could become a Jim Crow issue, we ought to be sleeping at this wheel like most of our media were doing when they did it in the 60s. And so I'm not going to be that media, and I'm not going to apologize for it. On the other hand, as my folks can tell you, I get real tough on them about being too opinionated in their stories or not looking at a different side. On personhood, I really wanted to nail all the sides. And then I think if you do that well, often and on that issue is a perfect example. You didn't have to be pro-abortion rights to be anti-personhood if you had enough information.
Well, I think that probably wraps up our time. Or did you have another?
Well, I was going to say that Donna does right line between news and op-ed too, and she also fact checks for op-ed. So
Yeah, I do, which really hurts the feelings of some people that they have to be fact checked. I will hang out though if anybody wants to ask anything else or whatever.
Well, Donna Ladd, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And thank you for coming.